I held my granddaughter for the first time in silence. My fingers, creased with years of nursing and knitting, curled around her tiny bundled body like a prayer. I wasn't sure I was allowed to say out loud. She was only 3 days old and still smelled like milk and sleep. Her face, the size of my palm, twitched as she dreamed. I didn't dare breathe too hard. Moments like this could dissolve if you noticed them too much. Mark was standing by the mantel, arms folded like a closed door. He had his father's stance when he was nervous, shoulders too tight, jaw set. But his eyes wouldn't meet mine. Not since yesterday. Jessica came in from the hallway, holding her phone like a badge. She didn't glance at me. Not at the baby. She looked straight at my purse on the couch. "Did you post something?" I blinked, unsure if I'd misheard. "On Facebook," she clarified, her voice tight like a pulled thread. "Did you post about her?" I smiled instinctively, as if warmth could erase tension. Just a little announcement. A photo of her hand, nothing showing her face. "My friends have been asking, and I was just so..." Jessica stepped forward and plucked the baby from my arms mid-sentence. Not roughly, but not gently either, like she was untangling her coat from a stranger. "I told you not to post anything." Her voice dropped to a whisper, but it was the kind people use when they wanted to sting more. "You're not family." "Not really. This is my baby, and I decide who gets to announce what." I looked at Mark, hoping, praying for him to say something. Anything. But he just rubbed the back of his neck and stared at a spot near the floor. Jessica turned, pacing toward the nursery with the baby against her shoulder. "Delete it. Now." Pulled out my phone slowly, like I was holding a broken wing. My thumb hovered above the screen. "You don't get to decide when you're included," she said, without turning back. "You gave birth to Mark, that's it. But this child, she belongs to us. Not your scrapbook. Not your friends. Us." I opened the app, found the post and pressed delete. The screen asked if I was sure. I tapped yes without hesitating. Jessica disappeared down the hallway, with her daughter in her arms. Mark moved like he wanted to follow but hesitated near the archway. I met his eyes, and for a second, I thought I saw guilt. Or maybe just the shadow of it. He opened his mouth, then closed it again and followed his wife down the hallway. Room fell silent. Only the faint ticking of the wall clock reminded me that time still moved forward. I stood slowly, gathering my purse, tucking my shawl around my shoulders. My beads clinked softly against one another as I walked toward the door. At the threshold, I turned back once, half expecting to be called back, but nothing came. Outside, the air was dry and warm, the way late spring in Tennessee always felt like. It hadn't decided whether to be kind or cruel. I sat in my car a full 5 minutes before starting the engine. That post wasn't just a photo. It was a small flag, a symbol that said, "I'm here. I love her. I exist in this story." And now, it was gone. What Jessica didn't know was that I had already scheduled an interview. Not with the press, not with a parenting blog, but with the station manager at WTTK Channel 7. I'd been the anonymous donor behind their Community Heroes segment for 15 years. Funded quiet spotlights on retired teachers, war veterans, women who cooked for flood victims out of church basements. Tomorrow's feature was set. I'd already signed the release, already submitted my story under a pen name. But I hadn't confirmed which day I'd appeared. Until now. As I drove home, I dialed a number from memory. "Hi, Beth. It's Dorothy Mitchell. Yes, the one from the quilt. Drive. I'd like to move my segment up. Tomorrow if possible." Beth was chipper as ever. "Absolutely, Dorothy. You know we'd bend over backward for you. Are you sure you want to appear on camera this time?" "I'm sure. She paused. What's the focus of the story again? Generations, I said. And what happens when one gets left behind? We settled the rest of the details in minutes. That night, I sat in my reading chair, the one with the worn floral cushion and arms smooth from years of my elbows resting there. I pulled out the baby blanket I knitted before the birth, soft purples and greens, no hard edges. I ran my fingers along the yarn and remembered the night I finished it. I thought about the baby's name, wondered if she'd have Jessica's curls or Mark's dimples. And I'd imagined myself holding her, rocking her, singing her the lullaby I used to hum when Mark had the flu at age 5. That image had been replaced now. I Jessica's back as she disappeared down the hallway. I Mark's silence, by the screen asking me if I was sure I wanted to erase my own joy. I folded the blanket gently and placed it beside my front door, ready for the morning. I wasn't going to post online again. I was going to speak where the whole town could hear. Arrived home just after sunset. The porch light flickered as I stepped up the last stair, my bones aching in the familiar places. My house, a small craftsman tucked between two larger homes on Maple Ridge Lane, greeted me with its usual quiet. I unlocked the door and stepped into the cool hush of my entryway. I left my purse on the table by the stairs and shrugged out of my shawl. The house didn't smell like baby powder or milk. It smelled like lemon oil and old paper, and a touch of eucalyptus from the diffuser. I kept near the hall. I kicked off my shoes and walked to the kitchen, reaching for the kettle. The whir of the flame came to life, and I set out a single teacup. Jasmine tonight. It helped when the thoughts refused to be still. As the water heated, I pulled a worn shoebox from the sideboard. Inside were old photographs, Mark at 10, sitting in the outfield with a baseball glove 2 sizes too big. A shot of me in my nurse's uniform, hair pinned tight, eyes exhausted but steady. A card from his college graduation. To the best mom, thank you for never giving up on me. I touched the corner of that card with the back of my knuckle. I hadn't thought about it in years. He'd cried the night he got into Vanderbilt. Cried when I told him I'd take extra shifts to help him with the cost. I hadn't minded. Back then, he made me feel like I mattered. Like being his mother was still a title of honor, not inconvenience. The kettle hissed, and I poured the hot water over the tea bag. As it steeped, I opened the drawer under the phone nook and pulled out the folder labeled Baby Hope's Fund. Inside, I kept the deposit records $10,000 from my savings, set aside 6 months before Jessica even announced the pregnancy. I'd thought it would be a gift for the baby's future, something they could add to over time. Mark had hugged me when I told him, kissed my cheek and said, "She's not even born yet, and she's already loved this much." I believed him. I tucked the folder back into the drawer and sat at the kitchen table. The steam from the tea curled upward, catching the dim light. I wrapped my hands around the cup and let the warmth seep into my palms. They thought I would crumble. Jessica, with her clipped words and sharpened smiles. Mark, with his half-hearted silences. But they didn't understand the kind of woman who survives the things I have. When my husband died in that car crash, Mark was 8. I remember sitting on the floor of the A waiting room, still wearing my uniform, hands covered in someone else's blood. I hadn't even taken off my gloves. When the doctor told me, my knees went out, but my voice didn't. I'd learned long ago that the loudest grief does its screaming in private. I raised Mark through years of unpaid overtime, night shifts that bled into mornings, scraped together lunches and rented clarinets, and the smell of burned grilled cheese because I forgot it on the stove while helping him with homework. And now I was being edited out of the story. I stood and walked to the hall closet, reaching up to the top shelf. Behind the extra linens was a small fabric box I hadn't touched since the start of the year. I brought it down gently and opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was the news segment planning binder. I'd kept meticulous notes over the year's scripts, voiceover edits, community spotlights, interview leads. Every segment I'd funded was logged here with its impact summary. 12 years of anonymous giving. Quiet, careful spotlighting of people who rarely got seen. Retired postal workers. Single dads raising 4 kids. A bus driver who'd pulled 2 teens from a car wreck. All of them had thanked the camera. None of them knew the woman who'd paid for the airtime. I flipped to the blank section marked reserved personal feature. I hadn't meant to use it. But now, the timing felt prophetic. Like I'd always known this would come. Jessica thought she was cutting me off. She hadn't realized. I'd been watching this family from the background for years, learning when to act, when to wait, and when to press record. I opened a fresh page in the binder and began to write. Segment title: Invisible Hands. A Grandmother's Love. Air date: pending confirmation. Interview location: WTK. Studio: segment room B. Main focus: the silent labor of older women in modern families. Sacrifice. Erasure. Quiet dignity. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. By the time the tea had cooled, I'd outlined half the segment. I decided not to mention Jessica's name or Mark's. No need. Let the viewers connect the dots. Let them see the pattern. I would be soft-spoken, yes. But I would not be small. The house settled around me as night fully fell. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's wind chime sang a minor key tune in the breeze. I closed the binder, returned it to its place, and walked to the living room. On the mantel sat a photo of Mark, age 3, cradled in my lap. He'd been sick that day, fever high, cheeks flushed, but he'd wanted me to hold him like a baby, just one more time. I still would if he asked, but I wasn't going to wait in the cold anymore, nose pressed to the window of a life I helped build, only to be told I wasn't welcome inside. Tomorrow, I'd dress carefully, colorfully, the way I used to when I spoke at retirement fundraisers or stood behind podiums at the hospital gala. Let them call me dramatic. Let them call me old. I would call it telling the truth. The next morning came with the low hush of rain tapping on the windows. I opened the curtains to grey skies, soft and thick as an old wool coat, and watched water trace long rivulets down the glass. It felt right, that kind of weather. A day for remembering what's been said and what hasn't. A day to hold silence like a spoonful of something bitter, but necessary. I dressed with care. A turquoise dress with bright pink flowers, the kind Jessica once called vintage theatre. Curtain, though I knew she meant it as a jab. My beads clicked gently as I slipped them over my neck. 3 strands of glass and stone in shades of red and earth. I'd bought them years ago at a market in Asheville, during a trip I took by myself, the first after Mark moved out. That had been the first time I realized solitude and loneliness weren't the same thing. By 9, I was sitting in the lobby of WTK Channel 7 with a canvas tote beside me. Inside it, my binder, one carefully wrapped baby blanket, and a letter I'd written just before dawn. The letter was not to be read on air. It was for the station manager, Beth, to keep on file my own terms for how far this story would go. No names, no blame, just truth. Only truth. Beth came out to greet me in heels and a raincoat, her energy as warm as it had been on the phone. "Dorothy," she said, beaming. "It's good to finally put a face to the heart that's been behind this segment all these years." She led me down a hallway painted in cheerful shades of blue and gold. The studio smelled faintly of coffee and cables, that oddly comforting scent of backstage places. We passed cameras being wheeled into position, and a makeup artist humming quietly under her breath. Segment Room B is prepped. You'll be sitting with Jamie Taylor. She's sensitive, thoughtful. She's been briefed on your request for anonymity. Regarding the family. Beth glanced over at me. You ready? I nodded. Yes. I've been ready longer than I knew. In the green room, I waited as a young intern touched up my cheeks with a light dusting of powder. Just enough to cut the glare, she said, kindly. Her name tag read Maya. I liked her eyes direct, but not invasive, the way a good nurse learns to look. 10 minutes later, I was seated in a quiet room with soft lighting and a velvet chair too modern for its own comfort. Jamie introduced herself, shook my hand, and said, You just talk. I'll guide if needed. The interview lasted less than 20 minutes. I spoke plainly, carefully. I talked about raising a child alone, about the invisible labor women perform, long after the casseroles run out, and the bills stop coming in their name. I told her about my knitting, about the scholarship fund I started in secret, about the day I realized love didn't always come back in the form you gave it. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. The silence in the room said everything ID single quotes T. Afterward. Beth hugged me. It airs Friday evening, she said. I'll send you the link ahead of time. Thank you, I said. But I wasn't thanking her for the broadcast. I was thanking her for seeing me. That evening I stopped at the pharmacy for more arthritis cream. As I waited in line, I overheard 2 women chatting by the blood pressure machine. You hear about that new segment coming up? Something about a grandmother cut out by her own family? The other woman shook her head. No, but I'll be watching. Sounds like someone finally saying what half of us think and don't dare say. I paid for my cream and drove home slowly, letting their words echo longer than they should have. I wasn't ashamed. Not anymore. When I arrived back at my house, I found a pastel envelope in the mailbox addressed in Jessica's neat handwriting. No return address. Inside was a baby dedication invitation cream cardstock with gold leaf edges, all elegant swirls and curated joy. Beneath the date and time were the words, hosted by Jessica's family, with love and celebration. My name was nowhere on it. Not in the list of family. Not on the RSVP line. Nothing. But that wasn't what made me sit down on the front steps. It was the location. St. Elizabeth's Chapel. The same chapel Mark was baptized in. The same chapel where I once stood holding his tiny shoulders while he recited Psalm 23, his voice shaking at, Yea. Though I walk through the valley. I stared at the invitation until the ink blurred. It wasn't grief this time. It was something sharper, clean, like the snap of a ribbon when it's pulled too tight. They were rewriting the story in real time, with me left on the cutting room floor. I folded the card carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Then I walked inside, poured a cup of water, and sat at the kitchen table with my pen. I wasn't going to crash their event. I wasn't going to beg for inclusion. But I was going to make sure that, on the same day Jessica claimed her version of family in front of an altar, a different kind of story aired on every television screen in town. Let the chapel hold its silence. I had chosen a louder form of grace. I left the invitation on the hallway table beside the spare keys and grocery list pad. Let it sit there like a ghost of some celebration I hadn't been invited to, though I could still hear its whisper. By morning, the rain had stopped. The sky was pale, washed out, as if it too had nothing left to cry. I made my tea without hurry and sat beside the window, notebook in hand. I hadn't planned to write a letter, not really. But my fingers moved of their own accord. as if they'd been waiting for permission. I didn't address it to Jessica or Mark, just to whom it may concern in the years to come. I wrote about the time I carried Mark into the ER at 3 in the morning because he'd been gasping through an asthma attack. Blue at the lips, small as a bird in winter. I wrote about the Christmases when I skipped heating oil to buy him books. I wrote about rocking him to sleep with a cracked lullaby voice, when even I didn't believe things would get better. Then I folded the letter and placed it in the box marked for her, someday. Inside were the cards I'd been writing since the baby was born, one for each holiday they hadn't let me spend with her, one for each milestone I heard about secondhand or not at all. I imagined her reading them one day, long after this. Rift had grown old and dusty. Maybe she'd be 16, maybe 30, maybe only after becoming a mother herself. But the words would be there. Later that afternoon, I took a drive, not aimless, not impulsive, but necessary. I went to the house I'd helped them buy, the one I'd co-signed on when they didn't have enough credit to stand on their own. I didn't knock. I didn't park out front. I just pulled up on the opposite curb and sat behind the wheel. The blinds were drawn on the second floor. A blue plastic tricycle sat tipped over in the yard. A pink towel hung crooked on the porch rail, forgotten. I watched for a moment, feeling the awness of being a stranger to a home that had once been offered to me in gratitude. "You'll always have a home with us," Jessica had said the day they got the keys. She had tears in her eyes when she said it. Or maybe that's just how I remember it now. I turned the engine back on, not out of urgency, but so I wouldn't be mistaken for someone trying to linger where I didn't belong. Before I left, I took out a small legal folder from the glove compartment. Inside was a copy of the loan agreement and deed, both bearing my name. A reminder that while Jessica edited me out of baby showers and chapel programs, the documents behind their house still bore the ink of my signature. Not as a formality, but as foundation. They had borrowed from my past to build their future. And yet here I was, parked at the edge of that timeline like a punctuation mark no one asked for. Back home, I met with Mr. Latimer, my attorney. He had been handling my affairs since the year I retired and began helping other seniors navigate inheritance matters and estate complications. A quiet man, with fingers that always looked like they were about to adjust reading glasses, even when he wasn't wearing any. We reviewed the paperwork together, my co-signer status, the equity structure, the trust account I'd been building. For the baby, I explained what had happened. Not the emotion, just the facts. The exclusion, the quiet disrespect, the shifting narrative that made me an afterthought in a story I helped begin. "I'm not looking for revenge," I said plainly. "I don't see a vengeful woman sitting here," he replied. "I see a woman drawing new boundaries. We made changes to the trust. We updated the deed release clause to prevent any further loans being taken without my explicit consent. We documented the gifts I had given, gifts that now stood as quiet testimony against the idea that I'd never contributed." Before I left, Mr. Latimer paused. "Would you like to write a clause into your will, restricting access to these funds until your granddaughter turns 18? I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, "No. I trust her to find her way to the truth, if she ever wants it. But I want to make sure no one else speaks for me." He nodded, understanding the difference. That night, I went to the community center for a volunteer shift. Every Thursday, I led a support group for older women navigating late-life isolation, widows, estranged grandmothers, women displaced by downsizing and distance. We met in the small library room, the one with low armchairs and one humming radiator. Tonight's group was quiet. A new member had joined, a woman named Francine, thin as kindling, with a voice like breath through a cracked window. She spoke about her son, who now called his mother-in-law Mom. and how she hadn't been invited to her grandson's school recital. No one interrupted. We didn't need to. Silence was our language too. Afterward, I handed her a cup of tea and a folded paper. "What's this?" she asked. "Next Friday," I said. "Local Channel 7. There's going to be a segment. You might want to watch." She didn't ask why. She just nodded and held the paper close, like it might warm more than her hands. When I got home, the porch was still damp from the morning's rain. I sat down in my garden chair and looked at the planter box I'd let grow. Wild. The mint had overtaken the basil. The marigolds had dropped their last petals. Still, something green remained. Sometimes things bloom again when you least expect them. 3 days before the baby's dedication, I received a message from Mark. No greeting, no apology. Just a line of text like it was typed through gritted. "Teeth. Jessica says you can stop by to drop off the quilt. Just leave it on the porch. No mention of seeing the baby. No offer to speak. Not even a request to stay for 5 minutes. Just a porch. Like a stranger." I stared at the message a long time before closing the phone. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Some invitations aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to be remembered. Still, I folded the blanket carefully that evening. The one I'd spent 3 months knitting, unraveling sections that didn't feel soft enough. Choosing a palette of muted lilac, cream, and sage, not just colors, but hopes. I wrapped it in tissue and twine, then placed it in a paper bag with no card, not out of spite, out of restraint. I wasn't going to write a message to people who never read what mattered. That Friday morning, the same day my segment was scheduled to air, I dressed early. Same beaded necklace. Same dress Jessica called too loud. I added a woven shawl even though the air didn't require it, because I knew I might need something to hold. I drove slowly, window cracked, letting the wind roll through as if it might carry away the ache that still settled behind my ribs whenever I neared their street. It didn't. I parked a few houses down, where the neighbors wouldn't think twice, and walked the rest of the way. The sidewalk was cracked near the gutter, the way it had always been, but the front lawn had changed. Neater, trimmed like it, was trying too hard. There was a new wreath on the door, pink peonies and burlap ribbon, a stylized welcome. I paused at the bottom step. The baby blanket rested in the bag against my hip. Jessica opened the door before I could reach the porch. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just looked at me with the hollow neutrality of someone performing patience. "Thank you for bringing it," she said. I nodded. Her hand reached out halfway, like she might take the bag, but then she hesitated. "You didn't include a note?" "No." She adjusted the sleeve of her blouse. "We've been very clear about our boundaries. I hope that's understood." I took a step back and placed the bag gently beside the door, upright. The paper crinkled softly against the stone. "I understand," I said. "And I think you should know. You can lock every door in this house, Jessica, but you can't keep truth out." She blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "Excuse me?" I smiled, not unkindly, but like someone finally stepping off a ledge they were never meant to stand on. "You'll understand by evening. Maybe not today. But you will." Jessica's mouth pressed into a line. "I don't think threats are appropriate." "This isn't a threat," I said. "It's the sound a boundary makes when it holds." I turned and walked down the steps slowly, feeling each one like a stone beneath my feet. She didn't call after me. She didn't slam the door either. Just let it hang there, open behind me like the echo of something unfinished. Back in my car, I sat with the windows rolled up, hands resting quietly in my lap. I didn't cry. I hadn't for weeks. But I did feel something loosen in my chest. Something I'd held too long and too tight an expectation, maybe. Or a memory that needed to be folded away, like old linens never used. When I returned home, I found 3 messages from Beth at Channel 7. Segment finalized. Great feedback from preview team. You may want to be near a screen at 5 p.m. I turned off the notifications and set the phone down beside the kettle. I wasn't going to watch it alone. I knew that much. At 4:30. I left for the community center. The support group met once a week, but today I'd invited a few of the women to join me early for tea, for company, for the quiet understanding that only comes from those who have also been made invisible and chose not to disappear. Francine came. So did Lorraine, who'd raised 4 children and now rarely heard from any of them. And Maria, who'd once been a lawyer but hadn't been invited to her granddaughter's high school graduation. They brought store-bought cookies and a fresh pot of mint tea. We gathered in the library room, all soft chairs and muted lighting. A TV had been rolled in on a cart like it was still 1996. And the remote was sticky from old tape. But it worked. At exactly 5, the Community Heroes intro played. The music gentle, the voiceover familiar. And then I was there. Not as Dorothy the donor, or Dorothy the forgotten mother-in-law, but as myself. I didn't name names. I didn't assign blame. I spoke about absence, about what it means to love someone, through closed doors and tightened rules. About what it costs to show up for a child only to be told later that your presence is inconvenient. I spoke plainly. I spoke fully. The camera didn't flatter, but it didn't lie. Francine reached over and squeezed my hand once, firmly. By the end, the room was silent. Then Lorraine whispered, "That was the most I've heard anyone say what." I've never been able to explain. I didn't reply. I just nodded, my beads clicking softly against my chest as I exhaled. My truth had been spoken. Not shouted, not dramatized, just aired like laundry left too long in a drawer. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long orange lines across the parking lot. I stood a little taller when I walked to my car. The way you do when you've stopped asking for permission to matter. The morning after the segment aired, I found a voicemail waiting. Mark's voice hoarse, clipped, uncertain. "Mom, we saw the story. Jessica's upset. I don't know what to say. Can you call me?" He didn't say I'm sorry. He didn't say you mattered. Just that Jessica was upset. I deleted the message without listening to it again. I wasn't interested in their discomfort. I wasn't looking to be forgiven for telling the truth. By noon, 3 more calls came in, 2 from numbers I didn't recognize. One left a message. A woman named Carol. "Dorothy, I watched your segment last night and cried the whole way through. I haven't seen my grandson in 5 years. Thank you for putting into words what so many of us feel." Another woman from the support group had apparently posted a photo of us watching the segment together, tagging the community center. That thread was now full of messages, dozens of grandmothers sharing stories and comments, thanking me, offering prayers, remembering the names of children they weren't allowed to say out loud anymore. It was surreal, beautiful, strange, and then quiet. There was always a quiet after something large. A soft vacuum where the emotion had been. I found myself drifting around the house that afternoon, unsure of what to do with my hands. I rearranged the spice rack. I trimmed the mint in the planter box. I sat down and stared at the bookshelf, like the titles might change. Around 3, the doorbell rang. I opened it expecting a delivery or a neighbor needing help with their recycling bins. But it was Jessica. She stood on my porch in a crisp white blouse and high-waisted trousers, as though she'd dressed to look important. In her arms, the baby. Her face unreadable, but her jaw tense enough to crack a seed. "May I come in?" she asked. I hesitated. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I no longer rushed to open doors for people who had closed so many on me. Eventually, I nodded and stepped aside. She walked in stiffly, her heels clicking on the hardwood. She didn't sit, just stood in the center of my living room as if waiting for some formal cue to begin. "I saw your segment," she said. "And before you ask, yes, I'm upset. Not because you lied, but because you didn't tell the whole story." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Jessica continued. "You made it sound like we pushed you out of our lives for no reason. Like I woke up one day and decided you were too much." She rocked the baby slightly, but her tone was firm. "I know I've been guarded, and I know I've said things that probably hurt more than I realized. But I need you to understand something. When I had this baby, I didn't feel ready. I felt like everything was suddenly under a microscope. And you," she faltered, "you come in with your perfect blankets and your careful smiles and your endless stories about how you did everything alone. And it made me feel small. Like I was already failing just by being different." Her voice trembled. "You loved my child before I knew how to. And I didn't know where I fit next to that." I watched her closely. It was the first time I'd seen anything raw in her since the wedding. "I never wanted to replace you," I said softly. "I wanted to help, to be useful. And when that didn't work, I tried to step back. But I didn't know how to disappear quietly without leaving pieces of myself behind." Jessica looked down at the baby, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder. Her posture softened, only slightly. "I thought I was protecting her," she said. "But maybe I was just protecting my pride." The words hovered, unsure of where to land. "I don't want us to be enemies," she added. I moved to the armchair and slowly sat down, letting the silence breathe. I didn't fill it. I let it unfold around us until Jessica finally eased herself onto the couch. We sat like that for a moment. Two women on opposite shores of the same memory, not quite reaching, but facing one another at last. "I made a trust for her," I said finally. "She'd get it when she's older. College or whatever future she chooses. You don't need to worry. You won't see my name on her birth certificate, but she'll see mine someday in the right places." Jessica blinked, startled. "You didn't have to." "I know." She looked around the room, as though realizing for the first time that the furniture had changed since she'd last been inside. The framed photo of Mark as a child was gone from the mantel. In its place, a ceramic bowl full of lavender sprigs. "Why that story?" she asked quietly. "Why air it?" "Because I've spent years being polite and private, and it left me invisible." She nodded slowly. The baby stirred, letting out a soft sigh, her mouth puckering as if mid-dream. Jessica looked down at her daughter, my granddaughter, and something unreadable passed through her face. Fear, maybe. Or hope. "Would you like to hold her?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to be sure it was real. Jessica leaned forward and offered her gently. I extended my arms and gathered her close. The weight, the warmth, the rhythm of a new life, barely begun. I held her without speaking. She smelled like powder and milk and something else I couldn't name but had known all my life. My chest tightened not with grief, but with relief. The kind that hums softly after a long-held breath is finally released. Jessica sat back, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't know what happens next," she said. "Neither do I," I replied. "But this is a good place to begin again." The baby's weight rested gently against my chest, her breathing steady and warm, that small, wordless rhythm of new life. I hadn't held her since the day Jessica took her from my arms. That moment had seared itself into my memory, not for its cruelty, but for how cleanly it had severed something sacred. And now, here we were again, though nothing had returned to what it was. The moment had not rewound. We had simply stepped through it. Jessica didn't speak for a long while. Her eyes tracked the room, lingering on the old quilt draped over my chair, the half-finished jigsaw puzzle on the corner table, the worn edge of my kitchen doorway where Mark used to kick his shoes off too hard. "You didn't redecorate after Mark moved out," she said. I looked up. "No, I never felt the need to erase him." She flinched, not outwardly, but in the way people do when the truth lands too close to their pride. She nodded once, as if she deserved it. And maybe she did. "I didn't expect the news piece to feel personal," she said after a while. "But it did." "It was personal," I said gently, "but not vindictive." She shifted in her seat. "It made me think, not just about what we've done, but what we've missed." I told myself, we were protecting our child, but maybe we were just protecting a version of control that never actually existed. The baby stirred. I swayed slightly, the instinct of every mother, every grandmother. That muscle memory never leaves you, not really. She sleeps easier with you, Jessica said quietly, as if noticing it for the first time. I didn't reply. Some truths are better received when you let them hang in the air like soft dust in a sunbeam. A silence stretched between us wide, but not empty. Then Jessica asked the question I never expected her to voice. "Do you think I ruined everything?" It didn't come out as self-pity. It wasn't a plea for absolution. It was a simple inquiry, stripped bare. I looked at her and saw not the cold woman who once locked me out of my own grandchild's life, but a young mother, scared, unmoored by expectations she'd never spoken aloud. "No," I said, "but I think you mistook boundaries for barricades. And love doesn't need to be managed like a schedule. It needs room to breathe." She nodded slowly. "I thought if I controlled the narrative, I could control the outcome." "You learned that from the world," I said. "Not from me." A pause. "Mark's struggling," she added. "He's not sure how to face you." "He doesn't have to face me," I said, adjusting the baby's blanket. "He just has to stop hiding behind silence." Jessica sat forward, elbows on her knees, head bowed. "I don't know how to undo what we did." "You can't," I answered. "But you can stop repeating it." She looked up. Her face was thinner than it had been during the pregnancy, tired in that particular way only new mothers wear, fragile but alert, like something held together by instinct. "I don't want her to grow up thinking love is something that gets cut off when it becomes inconvenient," she said. That I believed. I nodded slowly. "Then show her what it means to return, even if it's messy, even if it takes time." She stood after a while, coming over to take the baby. As she lifted her daughter from my arms, I brushed my hand across the baby's forehead. She stirred. Again. Blinked once. Then nestled into her mother's shoulder. Jessica looked down at me. "Would you come to the dedication?" My breath caught, not out of excitement, but out of surprise at how quiet hope can sound when it finally finds a voice. "I wasn't invited," I said evenly. "You are now." "And what changed?" Jessica swallowed. "You stopped knocking." And I realized I missed the sound. We stood there a moment longer. I could feel the old tension between us like smoke still present, but beginning to thin. "I'll think about it," I said. Jessica nodded. She didn't press. She walked to the door and paused before opening it. "You can keep the blanket," I said softly. For the next one, if you ever need it. Jessica turned, eyes shining. We won't wait so long next time. Then she was gone. That night, I sat in my garden under the string lights I'd had Mark help me hang 5 summers ago. The mint in the planter had been trimmed, but still smelled strong. I held my journal in my lap, though I hadn't written in it yet. Instead, I looked out at the moonlight stretching across the lawn and thought about what it meant to be seen again. Not through a broadcast or a community segment, but in a living room with a baby in my arms and no one looking away. I thought of the women at the center, of the stories we'd shared, some with endings, many without. Not everyone got a Jessica coming to their porch. Not everyone got a maybe from the child who once left them behind. But every one of them deserved the right to stop asking. That, I knew now. Not every bridge needs to be crossed again. Some only need to be marked to say, I was here. I built something. Even if no one followed. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone turns around. The next morning was Sunday. I woke to birdsong instead of a buzzing phone, and for the first time in weeks, the quiet didn't feel like a punishment. It felt earned. I took my tea out to the porch, wrapped in the same shawl I'd worn during my interview at the station. The breeze was soft. My bones ached in the usual places, but not in a way that made me feel weak. Only aware. The kind of ache that reminds you how long you've lived. In the distance, church bells rang St. Elizabeth's, the chapel where the baby's dedication was happening that very morning. I imagined the sanctuary dressed in soft white linen, the pews dotted with Jessica's family, her mother most likely wearing pearls, and that restrained smile that rarely reached her eyes. Mark would be there too, in a pressed shirt and polished shoes, avoiding everyone's gaze when the minister mentioned family. I hadn't decided whether I would go. It wasn't out of pride. Not anymore. It was something else, something more protective. Not of myself, but of the fragile thing between us. That small budding shift. A crack in the wall that might one day become a door. Sometimes showing up too soon can seal it shut again. Still, I couldn't sit in silence all day. I needed motion, rhythm, something to do with my hands besides hold still. I pulled out my recipe tin battered and green with age, and thumbed through the handwritten cards. I chose my mother's coffee cake, the one with the cinnamon ripple, and the pecan topping. She used to say, "This cake doesn't solve problems, but it gives people a reason to stay in the same room long enough to remember why they matter to each other." I greased the pan and mixed the batter, humming as I worked. The smell filled the kitchen slowly, curling around the corners like warmth seeping into forgotten places. I thought about taking it to the dedication reception, unannounced. I thought about placing it quietly among the catered trays, no name tag, no message, but I didn't. Instead, I cut it into squares and boxed them up neatly, one for the neighbors, one for the community center, and one for Jessica. No note, just the cake. That would be enough. For now. Around midday, I heard a car pull into the drive. I opened the door before they could knock. Mark stood there, shifting from foot to foot like a man who still hadn't learned how to be comfortable in discomfort. Jessica stood beside him, the baby in a soft white dress, asleep. "We're not here to ask for anything," Mark said. I nodded. "Good. Because I'm not offering forgiveness on command." Jessica looked down, lips pressed tight, but her posture wasn't defensive. It was cautious. The kind of caution you carry when you know you're walking on someone else's ground. "Just wanted to say the dedication went well," Mark continued. "But it didn't feel complete." "That's often the way with ceremonies," I replied. "They happen in rooms filled with absence." Mark's face cracked just a little. "You should have been there." I was. He looked up. I gestured toward the porch swing. Here, listening to the bells, remembering who I am. Jessica shifted the baby in her arms. We were going to ask if you wanted to hold her again, but maybe that's too soon. No, I said, stepping forward. It's not. She offered the baby to me gently, like something sacred. I cradled her carefully, my fingers trembling. Just slightly, not from age, but from the weight of being allowed back into something I hadn't yet called home again. She smiled during the blessing. Jessica said softly, "First time we've seen her really respond to anyone." I looked down. The baby blinked slowly, her mouth forming a soft O before settling back into sleep. She knows, I said. Babies always know where love waits. Mark sat down. On the porch steps, Jessica joined him. We didn't speak for a while. The silence wasn't heavy. It was shared, like water passed around a circle of parched people. Eventually, Jessica spoke. "We've been reading the comments from your segment." Oh. People recognized us. Our neighbors, friends from the community group. We tried to ignore it at first, but it kept coming back to the same thing. What thing? I asked. That you never shamed us, she said. You told your story without naming us, and somehow that made it feel worse. I nodded. Because truth isn't a hammer, it's a mirror. Mark sighed. I didn't know how to defend you without making things worse with Jess. So I didn't say anything. And in doing nothing, I said gently, you chose. He nodded, not denying it. I regret it. I don't expect that to fix anything. I ran my thumb along the baby's cheek. It doesn't, but it's a beginning. They stayed for a little while longer. I offered them slices of the cake. We ate quietly on the porch, the breeze lifting my dress and rustling the nearby wind. Chimed just enough to remind us that time was moving, even when we weren't. Before they left, Mark stood and said, "Can we visit next week? Just to talk. No agenda." "Bring coffee," I said, "and stay long enough to wash the mugs after." Jessica smiled. Deal. They walked down the steps together, hands brushing but not quite touching, the baby's soft hat bobbing with each step. After they drove off, I sat back in the swing and closed my eyes. The afternoon was still, and for once, so was I. By midweek, the sky had shifted into the cooler blue that only arrives at the edge of seasons. The garden, once wild with late summer bloom, had begun to quiet. Even the mint, always unruly, had curled in on itself like it, too, needed rest. Mark had texted 2 days earlier. Sunday afternoon? Just us. I'll bring the coffee. I had replied simply. Bring her blanket too. There were still conversations we hadn't had. Words tucked into corners, waiting. But the house felt different now, less like a place abandoned, more like one slowly being readied for company again. That morning, I wandered into the spare room. Once, it had been a space for visitors. Then, during Jessica's pregnancy, I turned it into a nursery. Quietly, lovingly, before the lines were drawn. Remembered the day I painted the walls a soft sea glass green. How I'd stood in the middle of the room with a roller and a bucket of hope, thinking of bedtime stories and lullabies, of little fingers reaching toward morning light. When they pulled away from me, when Jessica changed the locks and told me I wasn't family, that room became a sealed box of intentions, unspoken. But today I opened the closet and pulled down the bin that had been sitting on the top shelf all this time. Inside were the remnants of that quiet dream. A soft mobile with felt stars, a stack of books I bought secondhand, a yellow duck lamp, and the rocking chair still there, draped in a white cotton sheet, untouched since the day I'd folded it up in grief. I ran my hand along the edge of the chair and sat slowly, the wood creaking beneath me like it remembered. This wasn't a nursery anymore. It was a witness. I stayed there for a while, letting the stillness hold me. The light fell across the window in a way that reminded me of a hospital room I once worked in, the way afternoon light softens everything, even loss. I didn't cry. I just breathed. Then I took the meal and packed it into a new box one I would send to them, labeled simply, "If she ever needs stars above her crib." I returned the chair to its corner and left the room as it was. I didn't need to redecorate. I only needed to reclaim the quiet for myself. Later that day, while sweeping the porch, my neighbor Carol waved from across the fence. "I saw Mark leaving here the other day," she said, leaning on her rake. "Didn't expect to see him back." "Neither did I," I answered. She smiled. "You always were steadier than people gave you credit for." I had to be. Life didn't offer me many soft landings. She nodded. "That story you shared, it made people talk. Even my daughter called me last night. First time in months. I didn't say anything. We just exchanged a knowing look, the kind of look women of our age give one another when words aren't enough, or too much." After dinner, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my journal. I hadn't written in it since the broadcast. September 14th, today I walked into a room I once prepared for someone I wasn't allowed to meet. I didn't open it in anger. I opened it to let the light in again. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing what you'll carry, and what you'll put down. I stopped writing. Then I stood and moved to the fireplace mantel, where I kept a photo of Mark as a baby, one of the few I hadn't taken down. In it, he was reaching toward the camera, cheeks flushed, a soft smudge of oatmeal on his chin. I traced the edge of the frame. Hadn't known then how hard it would be to let go, or how much harder it would be to stay gone. The next morning, I walked to the mailbox and found a small package wrapped in brown paper. No note, just my name written in careful script. Inside, the baby's dedication photo. A small print, no frame. Her eyes wide, her hand curled around the edge of her dress. Folded behind it, a copy of the church bulletin. And at the bottom of Abba, the special thanks section, one line. "To the woman who taught us the shape of love, Dorothy Mitchell." I pressed the paper flat against my table and stared at the words. Not for proof, but for the quiet fact of them. They had spoken. Not in apology, but in recognition. There is a difference. And I felt it settle into me like a final stitch at the edge of a long seam. I reached for the picture, held it between my fingers and whispered, "You are known." Friday evening brought the kind of hush that wraps a neighborhood in quiet reverence. Porch lights flicked on one by one, windows glowing amber behind drawn curtains, screen doors creaking softly before settling shut. I liked this time of day, the shift between noise and reflection, the pause before weekend rhythms began. I had just finished drying the last dish when there was a soft knock at the door. Not the hurried kind, not demanding, just present. I opened it to find Mark standing alone. He held a small tin of coffee and a grocery bag. He looked tired, but clear around the eyes, as if something had recently burned away the fog he'd been carrying. I said I'd bring coffee, he said with a faint smile. I nodded and stepped aside. Kitchen still warm. He followed me in and set the bag on the counter. "Jessica sends her love. She didn't want to crowd today. Thought it might be better if we started here." I reached for 2 mugs from the cabinet. "She's right." He took a seat at the kitchen table while I filled the kettle. The silence between us was no longer heavy. It held shape like something rebuilding itself quietly, beam by beam. "You were always up first," he said after a minute. I remember waking to the smell of coffee and the sound of the faucet. I needed the quiet before the day started. Demanding things. He chuckled, then fell serious again. I've been thinking a lot. About that room you made, the one we never stepped into. I didn't turn around. I let the water boil. I saw it, he continued. Jessica told me what you'd done. I was angry then. Sad you overstepped. But I think the truth is, I was scared it made me look small. I placed the mugs on the table, sat down across from him. Love isn't a competition. I know that now, he said, but I didn't then. And by the time I did, I'd already let too many things happen that I should have stopped. The kettle clicked. I poured the coffee slowly, letting the smell rise between us, steady and grounding. He reached into the grocery bag and pulled out a manila envelope. There's something I want you to see. I took it carefully and opened the flap. Inside were drawings, crayon and marker, colored scribbles on printer paper, a handprint, a stick figure family. In the corner of one, in blocky, misspelled letters, to Grandma. I looked up. She found your photo, he said. The one from the segment. Jessica had tucked it in a drawer, but she's curious now. She asks questions. And she's calling you Grandma even though no one told her to. My throat tightened. I traced a tiny handprint with my finger. She's 4 now. Already opinionated. Already seeing through the cracks. He folded his hands. I want her to know the whole story. Not just ours. Not just what Jessica and I managed to tell cleanly. I want her to know about where she came from. And that means knowing you. I exhaled slowly. Stories aren't always kind. They don't have to be, he said. They just have to be true. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy who used to run barefoot through the hallway, giggling because the floor was cold. The boy who used to curl up beside me on stormy nights and ask if thunder could break the sky. And I saw the man who had betrayed that memory, and now, finally, the man who had come back. You'll have to answer her one day, I said. When she asks why I wasn't there. He nodded. I will. And not with excuses. No, with truth. I stood and opened the drawer beside the fridge. From it, I pulled a worn leather-bound album one I hadn't opened in years. I set it on the table and flipped through the pages. Mark's preschool. Graduation. His first baseball glove. His 12th birthday when the power went out. And we lit candles on a stack of pancakes. She should know who she looks like when she furrows her brow, I said. That was your grandfather's face. Serious. Steady, but full of mischief when no one was watching. Mark smiled, eyes wet. I'd like to start a box, I said. A story box. Something for her. Photos, letters, little pieces of what you both left behind. I think she'd love that. He whispered. We spent the next hour in quiet conversation, pulling items from shelves, marking which ones belonged in that story box. A spoon from Mark's baby set. A poem my mother wrote me. A picture of my own grandmother, stoic, warm, the first woman I ever saw hold power with grace. It wasn't reconciliation in the Hollywood sense. There were no sweeping apologies, no grand declarations. Just an old woman and her son, building. A bridge out of paper and memory. When he stood to leave. He hugged me longer than usual. No words, just presence. As he walked out the door. He paused. She asked if you could come to her preschool day next Friday. They're letting grandparents read to the class. I met his eyes. Did you say yes? I said she'd be lucky if you did. I watched him walk to the car. The porch light casting soft halos across the sidewalk. Then I sat back down and opened the album again. And for the first time in years, I added something new. I didn't sleep much the night before Grandparents' Day. It wasn't nerves. It was the kind of anticipation that belongs more to memory than fear. The quiet pacing of a heart preparing to show up fully after being told not to. I ironed my dress, the deep violet one with loose sleeves and bright floral cuffs. I laid out my beaded necklace like a keepsake offering. I braided my hair, then let it loose again. Too formal. Too rigid. I brushed it out until it framed my face in its usual cloud. Untamed and proud. By 7:30 a.m., I was already at the table, packing a small cloth bag with the 3 books I'd chosen. One had been Mark's favorite, The Snowy Day. Another was a counting book with watercolor bunnies that always made him giggle when he was little. The third last stop on Market Street I chose because it reminded me of the life we built together when things were hard and love showed up in practical ways. Shared bus rides, second-hand jackets, hands held across cracked sidewalks. At 8:15, Mark pulled up in his car. I didn't wait for the doorbell. I stepped out, the morning sun bright enough to sting but soft enough to welcome. He grinned. "You look ready." "I've been ready a long time." He opened the passenger door for me without saying more. The drive was short but quiet. Neither of us spoke much, but not because there was nothing to say. It was a good silence, like 2 people listening for the same sound. The preschool was tucked behind a small park, one of those buildings with rainbow handprints painted on the front fence and pinwheels stuck into flower pots. The sidewalk was lined with parents and grandparents, some holding hands with eager little ones, others carrying juice boxes and trays of cupcakes. It smelled like wet mulch and anticipation. Inside, the classroom was chaos in the best way. Walls covered in construction paper art, alphabet charts strung along the windows, tiny coats hanging on pegs too low for my back to reach easily. Jessica was already there. She turned when she saw me, adjusting her daughter's pigtails. There was no stiffness in her smile this time, just relief. "Hi," she said, gently. "We saved you a seat." The little one, my granddaughter, ran toward me like she'd been waiting at the start of a race. She wore a yellow dress with sunflowers stitched at the hem and jelly sandals that squeaked with every step. "Grandma," she cried, arms outstretched. That word, that sound. I had waited for it not just for months, but for years. Through silence, through absence, through nights spent folding baby blankets I wasn't allowed to deliver. She reached me before I could kneel, and I scooped her into my arms. She smelled like strawberries and clay. I kissed the top of her head and whispered, "I brought a story. For you." She grinned, pulling back. "I want to sit in your lap. You'll get no argument from me." Jessica led us to a circle of chairs. The other children were bouncing and shifting, laughing in that way children do when grown-ups gather around like an audience. The teacher, a kind-eyed woman with silver hoops and comfortable shoes, welcomed each reader warmly. When it was my turn, my granddaughter helped me carry the books to the front of the group. "This one," she announced, holding up The Snowy Day, "was my daddy's favorite when he was little." A few kids murmured, "Cool," or "I have that book." I met Mark's eyes across the room. He looked down, smiling softly. Jessica's hand rested gently on his arm. I read slowly, not for drama but for memory. As I turned each page, the room quieted. Even the fidgeting stopped. The children leaned forward. I saw in their faces the magic of story time, how words can turn strangers into companions, how rhythm can open doors without needing keys. When I closed the last page, my granddaughter clapped first. Then the others followed, some louder than others. One little boy shouted, "That was the best one." I laughed and gave a small bow. "That's quite a compliment." After the event ended, Jessica handed me a juice box and said, You were amazing. I forgot how natural you are with children. I never forgot, I said. I just waited for someone to remember. She nodded slowly. Thank you for showing up today. And for everything before this. I didn't do it for thanks, I said. I did it because that's what we do when we love someone. We wait at the edge until they open the door. Mark joined us then. She wants you to come to the park after. Says she has something to show you. I smiled. Does it involve worms or dandelions? Both, Jessica said. And a painted rock she calls her treasure. I turned to my granddaughter and held out my hand. Lead the way, explorer. We walked out into the sun together, her small fingers gripping mine, her voice chattering about the treasure's exact hiding place. It wasn't the grand apology. It wasn't the public reconciliation I once imagined. But it was this. A child who called me grandma without hesitation. A family slowly turning toward the light, and a future no longer hidden behind a locked door. And after all the silence, all the redirections, all the absence, I was finally invited to belong. The park wasn't far, just a few blocks from the preschool, tucked behind a chain-link fence and wrapped in the kind of trees that shed with drama in October. The leaves had just begun their turn, burnt gold and copper brushing the sidewalks like a slow exhale. She ran ahead, arms outstretched like the breeze was carrying her, my granddaughter Sunlight in motion. She knows exactly where she's going, Mark said beside me. She always did, I replied. Jessica walked on my other side. She wasn't trying too hard. That mattered. Her posture was relaxed. Her eyes no longer guarded. For the first time, she wasn't watching me to see what I'd say. She was just walking with me. The little one stopped near a large oak and dropped. To her knees, hands digging into the soft earth around the roots. This is it, she shouted. This is where I keep it. She pulled out a rock painted with swirls of purple and glitter, a single sticker stuck in the center that read, "You are magic." She handed it to me like it was the crown jewel of some undiscovered land. I saved it for you, she said, breathless. Because you're the first grandma I ever met who reads books the way I imagine them. I crouched slowly, the way my knees now demanded, and took the rock in my hands. It was warm from where she'd held it, and imperfect in a way only children allow. Glitter in odd corners, a thumbprint in the paint. Beautiful because no one corrected it. You're quite the artist, I said. She leaned in close. Do you have a garden? I looked at her, unsure if she meant flowers or something deeper. Yes, I said. But I haven't planted anything. New in a long while. She frowned, thoughtful. You should. Gardens are for people who want things to grow. Jessica laughed softly behind her. She's on a mission lately. Keeps planting dandelion seeds in cups by the windowsill. Dandelions are brave, I said. They grow where people don't want them to, and still bloom bright. My granddaughter tilted her head. I like that. We spent the next hour gathering acorns and sticks, pretending we were building a castle from the forest floor. Jessica joined us, her knees grass-stained before she noticed and decided not to care. Mark took pictures, candid ones, not posed, like he wanted to remember. The shape of this afternoon exactly as it was. Before they left, my granddaughter pulled something from her backpack. A crumpled piece of paper folded into fourths. It's a map, she said. In case you get lost. She pointed to a scribbled path between a stick figure house and a heart drawn in pink marker. This is you. This is me. See? You just follow the dots. I took the map like it was a sacred document. You'll always know where to find me, she added. Jessica wrapped an arm around her daughter and said, We'd love to come by your place next weekend, if you're up for it. I didn't have to pause. I'd like that, I said. There's a patch of earth behind the porch that's been waiting for someone with small hands and big ideas. My granddaughter clapped. Can we plant lavender? And the brave flowers. Especially the brave ones. They walked to the car slowly, waving the way children do, wide and full-bodied, like goodbye means for now. I stayed in the park a while after they left. I sat on a bench beneath the oak, the painted rock still in my hands, the paper map folded carefully inside my purse. The light had softened, long shadows stretching across the grass. I listened to the breeze rustling the leaves, the occasional shriek of a child from a distant playground, the shuffle of squirrels busy with tasks older than memory. I let the quiet surround me. So many days I'd spent in silence, wondering if the story of my love would be buried with me, if the legacy I offered, one of presence, of persistence, would be erased in favor of a sleeker version of family. The kind you post about, but don't return calls to. But now I had been handed a map drawn in marker, lined with dots, marked with a heart dot, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was still waiting at the edge. I was being invited in, not for performance, not for obligation, but because love, when left alone, long enough blooms again. You just have to be patient enough to outlive the frost. I stood slowly, brushing off my dress, and walked a slow circle through the park before heading home. I picked up a few fallen leaves along the way, red, orange, gold. I would press them in wax paper later, tuck them into the story box I was building. Proof that the seasons did, indeed, change, that even the most forgotten corners of a life could grow soft again. They arrived just after noon on Sunday. The sun was already high, and the breeze had begun to stir the wind chimes on my porch low, thoughtful notes that lingered between the rustling mint leaves in the planter box. I had laid out the gardening tools before they arrived. A small trowel, a watering can shaped like a snail, a few seed packets, lavender, zinnias, and a paper envelope labeled Wild Mix, which I'd bought years ago and never opened. I didn't know what would grow from it. That was the point. My granddaughter ran straight to me, arms open, her cheeks flushed with anticipation. I wore my DIL clothes, she declared, spinning in a too big t-shirt that hung to her knees. Jessica followed with a basket of lunch wrapped in cloth. Mark carried a tray with lemonade and a pie. They weren't performing. There were no cameras, no curated moments. Just three people bringing themselves to a fourth who had, for a long time, sat at the edge of their frame. I opened the gate to the side yard where the soil was already turned, waiting. She picked a spot, Jessica said, near the fence, where the light hits in the afternoon. A good choice, I said, looking down at the strip of earth dappled with shade and possibility. We crouched together, my granddaughter and I, our hands in the dirt. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't worry about lines. She dug with her fingers, laughing when a worm wiggled free, gasping when she uncovered a buried marble from some forgotten game. She pressed seeds into the earth like wishes. "Who'll come up first?" she asked. "No telling," I said. "Some seeds bloom quickly. Others take their time." She nodded like she understood. Mark took photos, but only for us. No hashtags, no performances, just memory in motion. Later, we sat on the porch, drinking lemonade and eating slices of pie still warm from the oven. Jessica told a story about a time Mark got lost in the grocery store as a child, how he'd walked straight to the bakery and waited, certain that someone would find him eventually. "I knew she'd come," Mark said. "You always did," I smiled. "That's the thing about mothers. We stay on the list, even when the roster changes." There was a pause, not awkward, just full. Then Jessica reached into her bag and pulled out a small white envelope. "We'd planned to do this with just family," she said. "But that's the thing we realized you are." I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a formal announcement card. "We joyfully welcome our daughter's godmother and guardian, Dorothy Mitchell." Beneath it, a photo of the baby holding a daisy, a tiny smile at the corner of her lips. I looked up. "You're sure?" Jessica nodded. "We are." Mark reached over, his hand resting gently atop mine. "It's overdue, but still yours." For a long time, I had dreamed of this moment. Not for the title, not for the role, but for the recognition, for the invitation to speak love aloud, without editing myself into something smaller. "I was going to announce her birth," I said, softly. "Back when she was born." I had a post typed up, a photo of her hand. I deleted it when Jessica asked. "And me too." I told myself dignity meant staying quiet. Jessica swallowed. "I know. But I've learned something since," I continued. "Sometimes dignity means choosing when to speak louder, and choosing not to be erased." My granddaughter was sitting on the porch steps now, turning the glitter-painted rock over in her hands. She looked up. "Will you tell the story now, Grandma? The one about when you first saw her?" I smiled. "Of course." And so, for the first time, I told it not on a news segment, not behind a lawyer's desk, not as a protest, but as a grandmother surrounded by her family. I told her how small she was, how her fingers curled around nothing but still held everything, how my heart had cracked open that morning, not because of rejection, but because something sacred had entered the world, and I was told to look away. I told her how I held her once, just once, before the silence. "And now you hold me every time I see you," she said, scooting closer. "Yes," I whispered, "every single time." After they left, I walked back to the garden patch. The seeds were buried, the soil uneven and messy. A few plastic garden markers were already crooked. It was perfect. Inside, I placed the godmother announcement on the mantel, beside the rock, the map, and the story box now half full. I stood there for a long while, watching the light shift across the wall. I didn't need to post it anywhere. I didn't need likes or hearts, or the illusion of admiration. I had the only announcement that ever mattered. She called me Grandma. And this time, the whole world heard it.